On the 9th of June, 2021, a pilot flying over Northern Europe noticed something odd. His navigation display flickered. 3 seconds. Then fine. He logged it and moved on. He had no idea that in those 3 seconds, something in orbit had just reached down and switched off GPS across an entire continent. Nobody noticed for 3 years. In November 2024, Professor Todd Humphreys at the University of Texas received an anonymous tip. Look at 2 specific dates in a dataset from 2021. Specific times, specific stations. Humphreys is one of the world's leading GPS security experts, but he was skeptical. The data was publicly available, sitting online for years. If something unusual was in there, someone would have found it already. He looked anyway. And what he found sent him back through 7 years of data. The dataset came from the International GNSS service, hundreds of ground stations across Europe, Greenland, and Canada, continuously recording how strong satellite navigation signals are relative to background noise. Normally, that ratio is stable, predictable. On those 2 dates in 2021, every single station recorded the same thing simultaneously, a sudden, sharp drop. Signal strength falling by a factor of 10, navigation signals overwhelmed. Not one station, not a cluster, every station, all at once. Humphreys went back through 7 years of data, 75 days, same pattern, same simultaneity, continental scale, 3 to 10 seconds, then gone. Something had been doing this since 2019, and nobody had noticed. The obvious answer was interference from the ground, something broadcasting a stronger signal on the same frequency and drowning out the satellites. And there was an obvious suspect, Kaliningrad, the Russian military exclave on the Baltic Sea, a known hotspot for electronic warfare. Commercial aircraft had reported GPS disruptions traced back to transmitters there for years. It fit perfectly, until the math stopped it cold. The affected stations stretched from Spain to Svalbard to Canada. Even the tallest antenna in Kaliningrad, broadcasting at maximum power, could only affect aviation as far as Denmark. The curvature of the Earth would block the signal long before it reached Spain. This was not coming from the ground. Humphreys ran the geometry. For one source to hit every station simultaneously, it had to be above the horizon from all of them at the same moment. The calculation gave one answer, at least 1,200 kilometers above the Earth, higher than the International Space Station, higher than any aircraft, any drone, any balloon. It had to be a satellite. GPS interference from space, at continental scale, had never been documented before in human history. But there was one more detail that made this impossible to explain away. When Humphreys mapped the 75 events by day of the week, a pattern appeared immediately. They were happening on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, during business hours in Europe. No hardware malfunction respects a work schedule. This was deliberate. Now the question changed. Not what is causing this, which satellite, and who controls it. There are over 15,000 active satellites in orbit, but the geometry filtered 98% of them immediately. The source had to be visible above the horizon from Spain, Greenland, Canada, and Poland, all simultaneously. That left satellites in very high orbits. 14 candidates remained. One immediately stood out, an Algerian satellite with publicly documented transmitters operating on exactly the right frequency. It fit on paper, until they checked its own signal data during the interference events. Its signal had dropped too. The Algerian satellite was not the source. It was another victim. The trail went cold for 4 months. In September 2025, Humphreys took the investigation public at a conference in Baltimore. The room was packed. Other researchers had been logging unexplained GPS disruptions for years without a cause. Now they had a framework. A community started working the problem together. The German Aerospace Center pointed a large tracking dish at candidate satellites during live interference windows. Satellite after satellite, nothing. Weeks passed, then months, then an email arrived. A researcher in Europe had something Humphreys had been missing the entire time. Raw data, not processed measurements, not cleaned summaries. The actual radio signal itself. Millions of samples per second, from 2 stations. One in Amsterdam, one in Trondheim, Norway. captured during a live interference event on February 11th, 2026. This changed everything. With process data, you can see a signal dropped, but not precisely when, not with enough resolution to compare one station to another. With raw data, you can measure the exact microsecond the interference arrived at each location. The signal reached Trondheim 139 microseconds before Amsterdam. 139 microseconds, a fraction of a blink. But that number drew a shape in space, a curved surface, a hyperboloid, representing every possible location where a source would produce exactly that timing difference. The source had to be somewhere on that surface. And because the raw data captured 2.5 continuous seconds, as the satellite moved slightly through its orbit, the surface shifted. The real source had to stay perfectly aligned with it the entire time. That constraint was brutally precise. Humphreys and Clements worked independently for 1 week, no communication, then compared results. They got different answers. Humphreys had an error in his code. He fixed it. Their numbers matched exactly. For every satellite in the database, they asked one question. If this signal came from here, does the timing match? Satellite after satellite, no match. Until one did. Not approximately, dead on. Cosmos 2546, Russian, launched May 2020. Part of a constellation of 6 military satellites, Russia's early warning network for detecting ballistic missile launches. These satellites use a Molniya orbit, a highly elliptical path that carries them high over the northern hemisphere, where they slow down and linger. From that altitude, a single satellite can watch all of Europe, Greenland, and parts of Canada simultaneously. One complication. Cosmos 2546 launched in 2020. The events went back to 2019, but the constellation had been building since 2015. The first satellite launched in September 2019. The first interference event was recorded 1 month later. The constellation as a whole was responsible. Different satellites on different days. Cosmos 2546 was the one the timing data proved. Now the question that matters most. Why? The signals were hundreds of times stronger than a normal GPS transmission, but they were slightly offset from the GPS frequency, not directly on the L1 band. Close, but not on it. That offset is the detail Humphreys keeps returning to. If you want to blind every navigation system across a continent, you put your signal directly on the frequency. Unless you are not ready to do that yet. Unless you are testing, checking power levels, verifying the signal reaches the ground, running the system on a Tuesday morning when nobody is looking too hard. And then, when the moment comes, in the opening hours of a real conflict, you tune the transmitter down slightly, directly onto the L1 band, and GPS across an entire continent goes dark. One more detail makes this harder to dismiss. The raw data showed a second interference burst at a different frequency, the frequency used by China's Beidou navigation system. The interference hit GPS, it hit Galileo, it hit Beidou. It did not touch GLONASS, Russia's own navigation system. That is not an accident. Humphreys is careful with his words. He will not call it a weapon being actively deployed. The brevity of the events, the frequency offset, these leave room for alternative explanations. One European research team suggested these might be operational communications from the missile warning satellites, signals that happen to overlap with civilian navigation frequencies as a side effect rather than a deliberate act. But the pattern is too consistent for a malfunction, the schedule too precise for coincidence. I can no longer say this is accidental with confidence, Humphreys said. I'm leaning toward this being a periodic test of a capability that, if deployed in anger, would be very damaging. Here's what that capability actually means. GPS is not just directions on your phone, it is infrastructure. Aviation uses it for precision approaches. Global shipping coordinates thousands of vessels with it. Financial systems use GPS timing signals to synchronize transactions. A disruption cascades into markets within seconds. Emergency services, cell towers, logistics networks, power grids, everything that runs on precise timing and precise location runs on GPS. And from 1,200 kilometers up, Russia's early warning satellites can see all of it simultaneously. The researcher who first tipped off the investigation put it simply: if this system were fully switched on, not tested, not offset, not brief, It would send shockwaves of fear through the world, because an entirely new kind of weapon would have been revealed, one that operates from space, one that cannot be shot down with a missile or jammed from the ground, one that, at any moment of their choosing, could be turned on over any country or any continent. The world has never faced that before. Until now, we just did not know it existed. The good news is we already know how to fix it, not by defending against the jamming, by making GPS less essential to begin with. Some countries are already doing this. South Korea, China, and the United Kingdom are building backup navigation networks that do not rely on signals from space. Fiber optic cables sharing time from atomic clocks on the ground. Systems like ELORAN, massive high-powered ground transmitters, far too powerful to be overwhelmed by a satellite. But most countries, including the United States, remain almost entirely dependent on GPS. That needs to change. Because the satellite is already up there, the capability already exists. The tests have already been running for 6 years. The only question left is whether the world decides to fix its dependency before it becomes a problem, or after. Tell me in the comments, did you know how fragile GPS actually is before watching this? And there is another side to this story I have not covered yet. GPS spoofing, where instead of jamming your signal, someone replaces it with a fake one, feeding you false coordinates that look completely real. It is affecting over 1,500 flights every single day right now. That video is next. Subscribe so you do not miss it.